It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. A recently released OECD study finds that the middle class in 34 developed countries is being squeezed to such an extent that its income is shrinking. The study, titled Under Pressure, the Squeezed Middle Class, looks at growing economic hardship of the middle class, and especially of the younger generation, among OECD member states. The OECD, or Organization for Economic and Development and Cooperation, is an organization with 36 member states, mostly of the world's more developed economies. Joining me now to discuss the report is Michael Förster. He is a senior economist and policy analyst at the OECD Directorate for Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs, and is a co-author of the aforementioned report. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Greg.
So why is it important, first of all, to study the changes in the middle class rather than discuss average trends in standard of living or the extent of poverty in a society?
Well, the point is that the middle class is the economic foundation of a society, but not only that, it's the democratic foundation. And not to forget, in OECD countries, the middle class pays 2/3 of taxes and social contributions, but it's also a recipient of 2/3 of transfers and benefits. So the middle class is, in a way, a guarantee for a well-functioning, prosperous society, and used to be, in the past, the center of aspiration. But in the last 1 to 2 generations, this dream has started to vanish.
So yeah, that's actually the next point. It's why exactly is it shrinking, and why is it this dream starting to diminish? I mean, what are your main findings about the middle class, and in what are the main ways under which it is under pressure, as the report says? Also, if you can mention, are there any countries that particularly stand out?
Yeah, it's not so much about the shrinking size of the middle class. Middle class decreased by 3 to 4 percentage points. In the US, a bit more, 5 points. But the point is rather when you look over generations. So it used to be very common to be part of the middle class for the baby boomers. But since that generation, the probability to reach the middle class has been dropped significantly. That's one point. And this is due to 3 concurrent developments. One is lacking or sluggish income growth. So in most OECD countries, income growth since the last 10 years is much, much lower, especially at the middle. Second is insecurity on the labor market. The new labor market structure makes it that you have less of a security. And thirdly, the costs of a typical middle-class lifestyle have increased a lot. Typical middle-class lifestyle means housing, education, hotels. So in some countries, it's more the housing, like in France. Some countries, it's more the education, like in the UK. And in the US, it's all the 3 of them.
So are there any countries, though, that particularly stand out in terms of the increasing difficulties that the middle class has?
Well, in European countries, it's a bit more in Germany than in other countries. And on an OECD level, yes, it is the United States, which has a very smaller middle class than actually other OECD countries. And it's very interesting because usually you have a correlation between overall living standards, or GDP per capita, if you wish, and strength of middle class. But there are 2 big exemptions to this picture. One is the US, with relatively very high GDP per capita, but the middle class, which is barely over 50%. The OECD average is 61%. And on the other exception are some Central European countries like the Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Slovenia, where you have relatively low GDP per capita, but they have very, very strong middle class.
So what happens if to the economy if the middle class is under pressure more, and if the new generation has greater difficulties in making it to the middle class? What does that mean for the economy, more generally speaking?
Well, if aspirations vanish, opportunities go hand in hand. And as I said, the point is less the overall size, but if for instance, the economic weight of the middle class, if you put together all incomes generated by the middle class and juxtaposes to the incomes of the upper class, well, this ratio was above 4 to 1 20 years ago, and today it's less than 3 to 1. And this, of course, it translates also in not only the economic weight, but also the political weight or the decision-making weight of the foundation of the society, which is the middle class. And just in passing, this ratio decreased from 2.5 in the US to below 2 now, 1.8.
Mm-hmm. And so, what are your recommendations for reversing this pressure on the middle class? What can governments do?
Well, there are several ways that governments can act. Since we have identified these three challenges, one is incomes, second one is labor market, third one is consumption expenditures, the policies need to be focusing on these three tools, these three dimensions. So the first one, in terms of income and distribution of income, there are many ways how you can foster a fairer distribution of wages, of earnings. For instance, through measures like you have in the US, the EITC, but to making it stronger, this in-work benefit. The second one is on labor market means devoting a lot to vocational and education training, and that this vocational and education training offers go to them who need it, which are young people and those in the lower middle class. And thirdly, in terms of consumption, well, depending whether it's in a particular country, the housing, education, or the health sector, but investing in services and also in the offer of housing that helps people to make it to the middle class.
Now, finally, I mean, this goes beyond your actual report, but I mean, historically speaking, the countries of the OECD have actually pursued many of those policies that you're recommending, but have been dismantling them in the past few decades. To a large extent, you could say because of globalization, because of neoliberalism, these kinds of tendencies, which, at least according to some of people's arguments, has been making it more difficult for them to offer these kinds of policies. So on a larger scale, what can be done? I mean, is it just that, is it something that the countries can actually fight against these, what some call neoliberal globalization? Or does something have to change on a global level to make it more possible for these countries to fight against the pressure on the middle class?
I think both is true. In an earlier report, which was called Divided We Stand, Why Inequality Keeps Growing, we have looked at the issue of globalization and other driving factors of inequality. And we found that policies are very much important and can change the game. Now, you're right that before the crisis, in the 2 decades before the crisis, there has been a different thinking about structural and structural growth policies. But I think, and we have a lot of examples for that, that since 2007, since 2008, governments, national governments, but also international organizations, including my own, have changed a bit course and now think in terms of inclusive growth, right? And this is, I think, the way to go.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Michael Förster, Senior Economist and Policy Analyst at the OECD Directorate for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. Thanks again, Michael, for having joined us today.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.